Environmental justice is considering how environmental pollution or environmental laws that affect pollution are differentially affect different populations. So how they would potentially, the idea is to safeguard people, but in essence what ends up happening is potentially impacting some population more and saving some population more. At least around here, I see that people fixate on water, but in reality, the population in most urban areas is getting their water source from a cleaner source. They're getting it from the same source that everybody else is. So it's the one democratic thing that happens is that everybody safeguards the water supply and everybody gets the same water source to some extent. Air pollution seems to be the new urban thing, and it's really, so there is potential for that, but in this area it's not, because in this area we put our water supplies for the most part up protected somewhere, and they're fed down into the system. So, but air pollution is really what people miss, and it's not industry necessarily, it's transportation corridors, it's highways, that sort of stuff. And if you look at asthma rates increasing in urban areas, like they've been doing the nursing program here, there's a big issue with basically air quality, especially for kids. So, you know, when you have a school that's parked right over top of I-5 at the bend where it always backs up every day, seems like a big potential problem. So, the other piece, the environmental justice piece that kind of gets lost to some extent, is the nutrition side of things. And so people don't think of it as environmental, but the same sort of idea of access to quality food in some way. And so, you know, the idea of, what do they call them, food deserts, I think, in urban areas, where you end up with nothing but 7-Eleven anywhere within walking distance of where people live in a lot of cases. And so they end up, that's where they get their nutrition from. So a lot of it ends up going into obesity and other things, potentially feeds into that. But, and if they carry any food, fresh food, the question is, where did it come from? Is it, I'm guessing it's not organic, and it's probably cheaper, so higher pesticides, whatever. For some reason, there's a reason it's cheaper, and so that potentially ties into exposure, because heart disease and obesity and things all actually compound environmental exposure health issues. So air pollution affects people who have poor nutrition much more than it does affect people who have fine nutrition. So. A population have access to green spaces is really important, and city planners started to recognize that a while back. And so Tacoma is actually, in some places, relatively better at that. In other places, not necessarily. But I think they're consciously looking at providing green spaces in all of those places. So I think that's an important consideration when you're trying to tie those things together. Is it's not just about nature as a pretty park thing, it's nature as an access point that's really vital to health. I do work on Wapato Lake down in South Tacoma, which is in a relatively poor section of town, and so it ends up being one of the few cheap available water resources for the population in the area to use, and it gets heavily used actually. But it's been so polluted lately that you can't swim in it. You can't have contact with it at some times. You can't eat fish out of it at some times. And so basically it ends up becoming a walking path, because this beautiful, you know, potentially valuable water resource has been neglected because the population that uses it isn't vocal enough. And so I see those kind of things happening where you have parks, but this idea of park is just a place to go be in green area is sort of not good enough. And the reason that you get attention is because the people that use that park are loud enough about it. And so, you know, when we've spent, I don't know how much money on doing the waterfront down on, by Ruston and that stuff, that's gotten a lot of money. Well, part of it is that there's money because of Superfund, but then we have this known problem source at Wapato that gets heavily used, used to be used for swim meets back in the day, and you can't swim in it, you can't fish in it, you can't boat in it. And so you kind of, that idea of how do you steer resources back into making it more than just a nice looking green space and something that could be more utilized. So to me, that's part of the environmental justice issue, is trying to make sure that those resources are actually usable by the population that people largely ignore. So I kind of see that in not just in pollution sources, but in access to green space and all that kind of stuff. Wapato is really, its source of water is all stormwater runoff from most of the south end of the city. Goes through, it's a stormwater retention basin more than a lake anymore. And so all of that stormwater carries a lot of nutrients, phosphorus and nitrogen and so on. And so it's really, and it's shallow. So it's basically ripe for making algae, is what it does. And so the algae, certain kinds of algae bloom and they're toxic. So that's kind of the issue. And for a while, there was actually a problem with the sewer from the mall being illegally connected to the stormwater. So human waste was basically going straight into the lake. So they finally figured that one out. I mean, there's another good example is the Theophos down here, which has been a super fun site since I moved here. And there's a sign down on, there's a floating dock back behind Johnny's Seafood, where you can get access and like fish off of there. But what you're going to catch mostly are bottom-dwelling fish, and the bottom has been highly contaminated in the past. And so they have a sign down there in multiple languages that says, you should not consume anything you collect from here. If you go down there any weekday, you're going to find people fishing and taking it home, usually Southeast Asian populations. And so it's not that they can't read, it's that it's part of their culture, it's part of their adding to the dietary intake for their families in a lot of cases. And so just to assume that we can wall something off and that will protect people, it doesn't fly. And so the idea of, but the rest of the population assumes, we would never collect shellfish from or eat fish from the Theophos because we know it's contaminated. That's not necessarily a viable argument for another part of the population here. So that's a big thing that people don't watch, they don't pay attention to. Environmental justice, the term unfortunately gets a negative reaction from people for whatever reason, because they don't understand it, and it sounds too touchy-feely. And I think that when you try to put it in more human health perspective, that it works. And so one of the things that I've seen, at least with my students, is one of the places I can put it is that getting them to go look at neighborhoods to figure out what the potential exposure sources are in that neighborhood, as well as food options and things to kind of tie those together. So I've done that as an exercise in my pollution public policy class. And so I make them, so we break it up into, I think we took middle school zones. So the area that feeds into a public middle school turns out to be about the right size for this. And you have them, each group has to go and actually do a driving tour of their particular area. And most of them have never been out of their one space that they live in this region. And so they don't know where it is. You have to give them a map of how to find these things, and they don't know where Hilltop is. And so you give them a map and they have to go drive around. And it's amazing what that little exercise can do to get them to start recognizing it even when they're just driving around. So it's that insidious teacher in me, is that once you get a visual cue as to what you're doing, you'll do it without thinking about it the next time. And so that kind of exercise would be, I think, applied in some way. So getting the kids, and centering around kids to me is the easiest way to get people to pay attention, because nobody cares about adults. They really don't. And kids are the bigger exposure source and so on. So if you think about it around schools, right? This
Yeah.
school's population lives in this area or comes mostly from this area, then it has a bigger impact. So trying to make videos or something that visualizes that for people on here's what this area looks like and what their options are, what their exposures are, I think has a lot of potential to try to draw people into it without calling it environmental justice, because I think the idea is to explain what that is in a visual way that gets it across to people. So to me, I think it's very useful for explaining, at least in the times that I've tried to do it, but it's trying to get that picture out to a larger population that's tougher to do. I think the people that are in those areas recognize it immediately. I think the people that are outside of those areas don't know where those areas are.